Thank you very much. Okay. Now, I should explain that image. I didn't just put that up because March 1st is going to be the 12th anniversary of the day that George Bush went onto the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln and declared mission accomplished. I put it up, and I'll explain to you in a minute why I put it up, but first I'm going to read you the first two paragraphs of the speech that President Bush gave that day. Paragraph 1. Officers and sailors of the USS Abraham Lincoln, my fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended, and in the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. Paragraph 2. And now our coalition is engaged in securing and reconstructing that country. Those two paragraphs are actually very different, and they really go to the heart of what I wanted to talk to you about today. They represent two very different kinds of problems. The first one deals with a well-executed, time-limited operation with a very clear goal, that is to topple the regime of Saddam Hussein. And the second one, stabilizing and reconstructing Iraq, deals with a very, very complex problem that keeps morphing with many moving parts, many players, and I think we'd all agree, no end in sight, even 12 years later. So I want to leave you today with three messages. First, we have gotten really good at addressing problems that share characteristics with Operation Iraqi Freedom. Secondly, many of our biggest challenges facing Canada and facing the rest of the world have more in common with securing and reconstructing Iraq than with winning a military operation. And finally, I think that means that we need to rethink our organizational structures, our approaches to problem solving, and our leadership values to be able to effectively address the big challenges that the world is facing. Because, in fact, ladies and gentlemen, and many of you here, I think, have been in government or are in government, we are organized for the challenges of the industrial age. Our model is based on hierarchy and command and control, and it requires top-down planning and efficient implementation. It requires clear jurisdiction, clarity of mandate, very detailed descriptions of responsibility, and it does very well with certain things. It does very well with the mass production of standardized services. It does well with executing complicated projects, things like dealing with natural disasters or collecting taxes, or even, with all due respect to Chris Hadfield, who will be out here in a few minutes, putting a man on the moon. And the thing about these kinds of projects is once you perfect a technical or a process solution, you can generally repeat it successfully over and over again. And it's great that we have developed this capacity because there are plenty of these problems. They're not going away anytime soon, nor is the vertical command and control model that deals with them. But I would say it's less effective in addressing many of the challenges that we now face. So there's been a lot of thinking over the past year or so heading towards Canada's 150th anniversary about what are the issues facing Canada and the world. There was a series in the Globe and Mail recently. The Social Science Humanities Research Council has looked at a list, as has the Trudeau Foundation. So here is a typical list. It's not an exhaustive list of possible challenges. Climate change, global food, water, and energy security, income inequality and poverty that we just heard about. What are the implications for Canadian sovereignty in an interconnected, resource-challenged, and warming world? What about threats to global peace and security from organized crime, from terrorism, and from conflict-affected and failed states? Or the future of our relations with Aboriginal peoples? Or how to promote population health with shrinking budgets, a growing burden of chronic disease, and an aging population? Or the implications of new technology on the future of work? As I said, this isn't an exhaustive list. I didn't come here to debate, what should or shouldn't be on the list, but just to illustrate the kind of complex issues that have emerged and the fact that a lot of these issues actually have connections with each other. Now, you would be right to note that a lot of these challenges are not new. They've been with us for some time, but I think that what has changed is the context within which we deal with these things. We face these issues in a world that is a lot more complex and connected, a world where power is diffusing and there are a lot more people demanding seats at the table. In international relations, we are witnessing a global power shift from the West to Asia and to the global South. And at the same time, we're seeing a transition from an era of American dominance to the reemergence of a multipolar world. And we are seeing the emergence of what we call non-state actors who are using new information technology to insist that their voices are heard. Forces for good and forces for evil. For everybody from people like Avaz.com, who does human rights petitions online, to ISIS, who have been quite brilliant at the use of social media to recruit. Now, in international relations, the growing number of players makes coordinated action more difficult than when power was concentrated in the West. And it has had an impact on the ability of our global machinery, our global governance bodies like the United Nations or the World Trade Organization, to get things done. Just think about how long negotiations have been going on the Doha round of trade negotiations without completion, or just think about the difficulty of achieving a comprehensive global agreement on climate change. But the same, I think, is true for domestic issues, where you've got people who are empowered by information technology, who demand to be heard, and who are using all means available, whether it's social media, traditional media, going to the courts, using international bodies. Just think about how environmental, non-governmental organizations and Aboriginal communities are demanding to be heard on natural resource development issues by governments and by the natural resource industry. So in this emerging world, I think the measure of power is connectedness. And there was an article written by Anne-Marie Slaughter in Foreign Affairs magazine in January of 2009 called America's Edge. And I'm just going to read you a short quote that I think captures some of this and maybe a little bit more. She said, "Men tend to see the world as made up of hierarchies of power, whereas women tend to see the world as containing webs of relationships and seek to move to the center. These two lenses capture the difference between the 20th and 21st century worlds. In this world, the state with the most connections will be the central player." So the context within which we face these big challenges has changed, with power shifting horizontally and shifting downwards and a lot more players in the mix. And that list of challenges and others like them have some common characteristics. First of all, for those of you who may remember the late Arthur Kroger, who was a deputy minister in the 1970s and 1980s, he coined a phrase, I think he coined the phrase, that we are dealing with permanent problems. These are permanent problems. They will not be solved within the news cycle or even within the mandate of any one government. And with all due respect to George W. Bush, there is not a moment on these issues when you get to say, mission accomplished. And each one of these complex issues has connections to other issues. So for example, if you're looking at policy instruments to intervene, the effectiveness of any one type of policy is going to be dependent for its support on other related instruments. So let me just unpack that for you for a second. Let's take criminal justice. If you want to use the criminal justice system to fight crime, it's not enough to pass tough-on-crime legislation unless you're also putting resources into policing, prosecution, and the courts, because it's actually a system. And because it's a system, you will be as effective as the weakest link in your system. Or, to stay with the criminal justice analogy, you need to understand what other disciplines can bring to the table. If your goal is crime reduction, you need to look beyond the criminal justice system to measures that address poverty, increase access to quality education, provide economic opportunity, provide healing for victims of abuse, and in fact, these may have a greater impact on crime than resources in the criminal justice system. And another characteristic of these challenges is that they're not static. They change. They are what's called emergent. And this means that there is a constant flow of information, and actors are constantly adopting their behavior in response. There's a great book called Power and Love by Adam Kahane, and he has a wonderful example of dealing with an emergent issue, and he chose the economic transformation of China, which is a pretty big issue. So Deng Xiaoping, who was the late Chinese leader who really led the economic transformation, referred to an emergent approach when he explained the challenge of transitioning China to a socialist market economy. And his approach is the antithesis of central planning. He said, "We are crossing the river by feeling for stones." And because we may not clearly see the connections between issues, we sometimes end up with unintended consequences. And my favorite example of this is the 2008 financial crisis, which can be traced to a number of distinct yet interconnected events, including the relaxation of bank regulations, low interest rate policies, the invention of new financial instruments. Now, some people could see some of these elements. Almost no one saw them all. And I think no one anticipated the impact of the drop in housing prices on the whole system, and the rest is history. The issues are socially complex. They involve actors from different sectors with different perspectives and interests. And it isn't sufficient for experts to impose their views. They implicate governments, but governments can't do this by themselves. They need to work with others. And these issues can't be successfully addressed without the involvement of the actors themselves. So to summarize my argument to this point, we are facing complex challenges that involve a multiplicity of players, where there are deep connections between issues, where the challenges keep evolving, but our public institutions are structured to deal with a different kind of challenge. They're vertically structured, and those hierarchies aren't going to disappear anytime soon. So the question is, how can this vertical model adapt to the emerging networked world? Now, there's lots of research and literature on trying to get at aspects of this issue. Brenda Zimmerman at York has been writing on complexity theory, and especially as how it applies to the delivery of healthcare. Jocelyn Bourgon, who's the former clerk of the Privy Council, is leading something called the New Synthesis Project, which is about building the capacity of public institutions to be prepared for the challenges of the 21st century. And there are people like Adam Kahane and Zaid Hassan who spent years convening multi-stakeholder dialogues to address tough problems. And right here in Ottawa, the Public Service of Canada has undertaken an initiative known as Blueprint 2020, which is about building the public service of the future. And what's interesting about that exercise is that it's a bottom-up exercise, and it's crowdsourced ideas from public servants. So in the spirit of that exercise, and as a former public servant, I thought I'd conclude with a few ideas about how government needs to adapt to this changed environment. Firstly, I'd say the public service needs to make collaborative leadership a priority. It needs to develop and promote leaders who can work well in the network world. Now, we have talked about this for a long time, and if you look at lists of management competencies that the government puts out, attributes of collaborative leadership appear on all of them, but the reality is that there's still too many leaders working in silos and protecting turf. Secondly, I think some of the soft skills need to be emphasized. We need to emphasize, for example, listening skills, listening to citizens, listening to the views of public servants across the country and those serving abroad who are going to be much better at understanding local conditions and needs than people who are sitting in boardrooms in Ottawa. Thirdly, to truly build this into the public service culture, I think you need to encourage senior public servants to spend more time in the country and in the world and less time in their offices and boardrooms. When I was Deputy Minister at Health, I learned more about youth at risk and community safety by visiting a school 10 minutes away from my office at Health Canada than I ever could have sitting through people presenting me with decks in my boardroom. This is not rocket science. It doesn't require a revolution in how work is organized, but even a commitment to spend a small amount of time engaging with Canadians can change how public servants see the world. The public service also needs to do more to encourage its people to understand the perspectives of the society they serve. If you think about the United States system, it's quite different. You've got thousands of people moving in and out of government, back to academia and business and think tanks with every change of administration. There are advantages and disadvantages to that system. I'm not advocating it, and we have been well served, I think, by a nonpartisan public service, but the disadvantage of our system is it keeps people from moving between sectors. So I think we need a much more ambitious approach to interchange, and we should create incentives for public servants to spend time in the private sector, in civil society, in academia, and vice versa. I also think we need to have more support for creative and critical thinking. The public service should encourage diversity of thought. We should be recruiting and promoting creative and lateral thinkers who aren't afraid to express off-the-wall views and who have the courage to disagree with an emerging consensus. Now, I'll acknowledge this is not something bureaucracies are known for doing that well. So how do you address it? Well, I think it starts with leadership. I think you need public service leaders who understand the importance of getting fearless advice, the cultural reticence to provide it, and therefore the importance for them to constantly reinforce the desire to have it. And some modest practice changes would help in this regard as well, like designating somebody to be a devil's advocate with a clear mandate to question prevailing views, or going to the not the usual suspects, seeking out the views of younger public servants who are not often heard in senior level meetings, but who may see the world differently. I also think that we need to invest in some of the analytical capacity that enables a better understanding of complex challenges. Techniques like scenario planning, multi-stakeholder dialogue, simulations, risk identification, and learning from mistakes. So the last thing I want to say on this, so far I've talked about the public service and how it needs to adapt, but in a sense the elephant in the room is that the public service is not elected. The public service serves the elected government, and there's only so far public service leadership can advance reform without buy-in from elected politicians. And none of this is going to work without a commitment to a relationship of trust and confidence between the government and the bureaucracy. So I think it's important to look at ways that could happen. The Prime Minister's Advisory Committee on Public Service, in its latest report, actually provided some interesting recommendations in this regard. They encourage the government to empower public servants with information technology, but not just with information technology. More importantly, the committee says they should be empowered with the freedom to do their jobs better. They say responsible risk-taking in the service of the government should be the norm and not an ambition. And that's very welcome advice to a lot of public servants. And they also emphasize the importance of long-range thinking about longer-term issues. The Prime Minister's Advisory Committee recognizes that the government needs to support an intelligent, connected public service that can draw on ideas and experience from around the world. So, to conclude quickly, I have 7 very quick points. First, we have been very well served by public institutions built for the challenges of the industrial age. Second, the world is more connected and more volatile now, with more voices demanding to be heard. Third, we need to reform our institutions to succeed in this new world. Fourth, how we do this is itself a complex challenge. And fifth, it will not happen quickly. There are many impediments, and we're going to make a lot of mistakes. And sixth, the biggest impediment of all may be complacency, that is, reluctance to change a model that has served us really well. So seventh, what is needed most is leadership that understands that the world is changing, that complacency is a trap, and that has the vision and courage to enable this transformation. Thank you.